You don't expect to feel ashamed of your own skin at 74. Not when it's sagged and softened with years, not when your hands tremble from teacups rather than romance. But shame crept up my spine the moment Caleb looked at me that morning, too long, too slow, his eyes trailing not in politeness, but in something colder, something inappropriate. He was standing in the hallway, shirtless, sweat dripping from his morning run, and I had just stepped out of the bathroom wrapped in a towel. I froze. Didn't think anyone would be up this early, he said, grinning like nothing was wrong, but his eyes didn't match his tone. I scurried into my room, heart hammering in my chest like I'd done something wrong, like I was the one who had invaded his privacy. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe my old mind was reading too much into it. But then came the second time. In the kitchen, I was cutting apples for a pie. Lily loved my pies, and he leaned in, so close I could smell the sweat on his neck and feel the heat from his breath. "You always smell like cinnamon," he murmured, voice soft, strange, like it belonged in a bar at midnight and not in a family kitchen. I dropped the knife, barely missed my own fingers, and looked at him, searching for some kind of joke in his eyes. But he just smiled, walked away like nothing had happened. I stood there trembling, staring at the half-cut apples, wondering if I was losing my mind. I never wanted to believe what I already knew. My granddaughter's husband was flirting with me, and the worst part was, I knew no one would believe me if I ever dared to say it out loud. The next few days passed like walking on shattered glass barefoot. I kept quiet, not because I was weak, but because I had lived long enough to know how quickly a woman's truth becomes twisted in a house full of people who don't want to hear it. I busied myself with chores, with folding laundry that wasn't mine, with watering plants that weren't mine, with making tea no one asked for. I watched Caleb from a distance, memorizing the way he hovered near me, how his hand would graze mine for just a second longer than necessary, how he always seemed to appear when I was alone. I tried convincing myself it was coincidence. That I was being foolish. That I was reading too much into glances and shadows and words that slithered under my skin. But you can't lie to a woman who's been through wars of marriage, years of widowhood, and decades of being invisible. We know when something's wrong. We feel it in our bones. I was sitting on the porch one afternoon, knitting slowly while Lily was at work, when Caleb stepped out and sat beside me. Too close again. I could feel the warmth of his thigh against mine. "You must have been something back in the day," he said, smiling, sipping his beer. I blinked. "Excuse me?" I asked, pretending I hadn't heard. "Back when you were young. I bet the boys chased you around town." He laughed, low and casual, like he was just making conversation, but his eyes were glinting, calculating, and they didn't leave my body for a second. "I was married for 49 years, I said coldly, not meeting his gaze. "And your wife is my granddaughter." He leaned back, stretched his arms lazily. "Relax, I'm just saying you've still got charm. Don't be so uptight." I stood up and walked inside without a word, chest tight with disgust and confusion, and as I closed the door behind me, I saw him smirking through the glass, like this was a game to him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell Lily. But the words caught in my throat like a splinter. Because how do you tell your granddaughter that the man she built her future with, the man she trusted, was slowly, deliberately turning you into his secret joke? That evening, at dinner, Caleb passed me the salad bowl and let his fingers brush mine again, deliberately, slowly, and Lily didn't notice. No one noticed. The whole room buzzed with conversation and clinking cutlery while my world twisted into a quiet nightmare. I went to bed that night hugging a pillow, tears soaking into the fabric, wondering how long I could endure this before I broke, and terrified of what would happen when I finally did. It started with a shattered teacup. Not from clumsiness, not from age, but from the way my hand jerked when I opened Lily's phone by mistake. It was sitting on the dining table while she cooked dinner, unlocked, glowing with notifications. I wasn't snooping. I was just cleaning, picking it up to move it away from the placemats, when I saw the message. A single notification from Caleb: "She's lonely. She wants it. You'll see." My breath stopped. My blood went cold. The cup slipped from my fingers and shattered across the floor, just as Lily turned around. "Grandma? Are you okay?" she asked, concerned, hurrying to me, but I couldn't even speak. I just stared at the message as it disappeared into her lock screen. I placed the phone down gently, heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear her voice. I should have told her then. I should have screamed the truth into the walls of that kitchen. But I didn't. Not yet. Because something inside me, something old and cautious and bruised from a lifetime of being dismissed, told me to wait. To gather proof. Because I'd seen this story before. Older woman. Younger man. The moment you speak, they laugh, they say you misunderstood, that you're confused, that it was you who imagined it, you who twisted things. I went to bed that night with my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt to open it the next morning. And then, 3 days later, the real attack began. Not from Caleb. From my family. From Lily. I had been folding laundry on the couch when she stormed in, eyes red, hands trembling, holding her phone. "You need to explain this," she said, her voice sharp and cracking. "What is this, Grandma?" She shoved the screen toward me. "A message. From my name. From my number. I can't stop thinking about you. I haven't felt this alive in years." I blinked. My mouth opened, then closed. I couldn't breathe. "That's not me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "That's not from me." She laughed bitterly, shaking her head, tears spilling from her eyes. "It's your number, Grandma. Don't lie to me." I stood, reaching for her arm. "Lily, I would never," she pulled away like I'd burned her. "Caleb showed me everything. He said you've been sending him texts. That you touched his arm. That you've been inappropriate. That he didn't want to tell me because he didn't want to embarrass you." My knees buckled. I had to hold the back of the chair to stay upright. "He's lying," I whispered. "He's manipulating you." But her face had already closed. Her heart had already locked itself behind walls I couldn't reach. "I don't know who you are anymore," she muttered. "Maybe you're lonelier than we thought." And just like that, I became the seductress. The predator. The shameful old woman who tried to steal attention from a younger man. I heard the whispers. From my own son, Michael, who shook his head and wouldn't meet my eyes when he came to pick Lily up the next day. From my daughter-in-law, Janice, who muttered ungrateful under her breath as she walked past me. They didn't even ask for my side. No one did. My decades of raising them, of folding their clothes, of wiping their tears, of standing in cold lines at the pharmacy for their children's cough syrup, all of it evaporated in one heartbeat. I went from Grandma to that woman. And Caleb? He walked through the house like a victim, eyes cast low, sighing like the weight of my betrayal was too much for him to bear. He even apologized to Lily in front of me. "I'm sorry she hurt you," he said, gently pulling her into his chest. I felt like I was drowning in the living room I'd once decorated for Christmas. I sat alone in my bedroom that night, listening to the sound of their laughter in the kitchen, my heart splitting open inside my ribcage. I wasn't just heartbroken, I was humiliated. Betrayed. And the worst part? I knew the only way to survive this was to fight back, not with words, because mine were already dismissed, but with proof. I had to become the woman they all believed I wasn't, and do the unthinkable, record the truth. I woke the next morning with something different burning in my chest, not grief, not heartbreak, but rage laced with clarity. I had been accused, cornered, and discarded like some perverse villain in a story I never signed up for. But this villain? She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to cry at their feet. No. She was going to watch. Listen. Trap. And expose. I walked to the thrift store that day, the one down by Willow Street that still sold ancient flip phones and old cassette players in dusty glass cases. I didn't want a smartphone. I wanted something small, silent, simple, something I could hide without suspicion. I found a battered old recording device, the kind that could run for hours off a single AA battery, and I bought it with the last $20 bill from my change jar. The woman at the counter looked at me like I was crazy. "People your age don't usually go for these," she said with a chuckle. I smiled, lips trembling. "That's exactly why I need it." That evening, while the house buzzed with life, with Lily humming in the kitchen and Caleb watching football in the living room, I slid the recorder beneath the couch cushion where he always sat, just beneath the seam, carefully wedged between the worn foam and the wooden frame. Then I waited. 3 hours passed before he took the bait. Lily had stepped out for a quick grocery run, leaving me alone with him. I was in the dining room dusting the shelves when he walked in, drink in hand, and leaned against the doorway like he owned the world. "That little scene the other day," he said, smiling, "you made it real dramatic." I didn't answer. I kept dusting. "You know," he continued, stepping closer, "if you had just played along, none of this would have happened. I gave you a chance to feel wanted. You threw it away." I turned and looked him dead in the eye. "You disgust me." He laughed. "And yet, you can't stop shaking when I touch you." My hands were trembling, but not from attraction. From pure, blinding hatred. I forced myself to say nothing more. To let the recorder do its work. After all, anything I said could be twisted. But his words? His smugness? His belief that I was powerless? That was the noose he was tightening around his own neck. That night, when Lily returned, he kissed her on the cheek, helped her put groceries away, and complimented her new blouse. The contrast between the man I'd just recorded and the man she married was so violent, it nearly made me sick. But I smiled. I smiled and said goodnight and retreated to my room like the docile old woman they all thought I was. There, behind my locked door, I pulled the recorder from my sweater pocket and listened to the audio over and over again. Every word. Every threat. Every calculated manipulation. It was all there, proof, finally, that I wasn't mad. That I wasn't making this up. That the real predator wasn't wearing gray hair and soft cardigans, but designer cologne and a self-righteous grin. I slept that night with the recorder under my pillow and a plan forming in my mind. I would not beg for their forgiveness. I would show them. I would let his own words destroy him. The silence that had once screamed shame at me now began to feel different. Like a storm was coming. A storm I was going to unleash, slowly, precisely, and without mercy. I waited exactly 4 days. 4 days of smiling when spoken to, of pretending to fumble with recipes I'd made for 50 years, of folding laundry I was no longer thanked for. I watched Caleb swagger through the house with the air of a man untouchable, his arm around Lily's waist, his phone constantly buzzing, his laugh echoing from room to room like nothing in the world could touch him. And why would he feel threatened? The whole family had swallowed his lies. I was the one walking on eggshells, the one eyed with suspicion. At dinner, no one asked me how my day was. No one noticed when I winced from hip pain. But I noticed everything. I noticed how Caleb's smile never reached his eyes, how Lily's laugh had a crack in it she didn't even hear, how my son Michael barely looked at me anymore. I wasn't ready to throw the bomb yet. I wanted them to be comfortable, to lean into their false safety, to believe I had surrendered. But I couldn't wait much longer. Not when my dignity was bleeding out, slow and invisible, every time someone avoided my gaze. On the 5th morning, I rose early, before the birds, before the coffee pot hissed its first breath. I placed the small recorder in the center of the kitchen table, right next to the basket of bananas and the stack of unopened mail. I didn't say a word. I just left it there, clicked on play, and walked out of the house. The tape had been cued to the most damning minute, his voice low and slimy, saying, "You know, if you had just played along, none of this would have happened. I gave you a chance to feel wanted." That line was a blade, and I let it cut them all in my absence. I went to Ruth's place, my old friend from the bridge club. She greeted me with warm eyes and strong coffee. I didn't tell her anything, not yet. I just needed to be somewhere safe when the storm hit. Because it would hit. 3 hours later, my phone rang. Not the smartphone my son gave me and likely monitored, but the old flip phone I'd hidden in my knitting bag. It was Michael. "Mom," he said, his voice dry, stunned. We heard the tape." Silence followed, heavy, full of guilt and something else, shame, maybe, or the sickening weight of realizing you've turned on the wrong person. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "I recorded it," I said simply. "Because no one believed me. Not even you." I didn't wait for him to speak. I ended the call. Then I turned the phone off. That was the first drop. The first crack in their glass house. The sound of Caleb's own voice, smooth and arrogant, pouring into the kitchen they once claimed was poisoned by my presence. I didn't go home that night. I stayed with Ruth, who didn't ask questions but handed me a folded quilt and extra socks like the war-weary veteran she was. The next morning, my phone was full of missed calls, Lily, Michael, even Janice. None from Caleb. Not a single message. I smiled. Because silence from the guilty is louder than any denial. I had spent weeks drowning in their accusations, but now the current was changing direction, and they were the ones gasping for breath. And still, I wasn't finished. This wasn't about punishment. This was about truth, about reclaiming my name, my peace, and the respect they'd stripped from me the moment a younger man's word weighed more than my decades of love. The war had just begun. And I wasn't going to be quiet anymore. I returned home just before noon, the following day, stepping into a house that felt foreign now, like it belonged to strangers playing a part in a play I was no longer cast in. The front door creaked open like it remembered my touch, but the air inside was still, unnaturally still. No laughter, no clinking dishes, no hum of conversation. Just silence. I walked into the kitchen, where the betrayal had bloomed and the truth had finally screamed, and found Lily sitting at the table, hands clasped tightly, eyes red and swollen. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The recorder sat in front of her like a confession, its presence small and yet louder than any apology could ever be. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice already cracking. I stood still, my coat still clinging to my shoulders, heart thudding, not with rage now, but with the unbearable ache of everything lost. I listened to it. All of it. I'm so sorry," she said, tears falling fast now, dripping onto the table. "I didn't know. I didn't want to believe it. I thought you," he said, her words tumbled, broken and panicked, but I didn't rush to soothe her. I let them sit. Let the pain marinate the same way mine had. Because it wasn't just about what Caleb had done, it was about how quickly they believed him. How fast my granddaughter, the girl I once rocked to sleep, turned me into a villain because of a few poisoned words from a man she'd only known for 3 years. She stood and tried to hug me. I didn't move. She paused, unsure. "I was wrong," she whispered, pleading now. "I was so wrong." I looked at her, my voice calm but colder than it had ever been. "You didn't even ask me," I said, each syllable deliberate. "You didn't look me in the eye. You didn't remember who I was to you. You just believed him." She sank back into her chair, sobbing. And still, I didn't cry. I had no tears left. Not for betrayal. Not for apologies that came too late. A door creaked upstairs. Caleb. He descended the staircase slowly, clearly expecting confrontation, but instead found only consequences. He looked different. Smaller. Like the recording had stripped away the charm and left the coward underneath. "Eleanor," he began, like we were old friends having a misunderstanding. I raised my hand. "Don't," I said, my voice cutting through the room like glass. "You spoke enough on that tape. Everyone has finally heard who you are." He tried to speak again, but Lily stood and screamed, "Get out." Her voice was thunder. He flinched. "Out of this house. Out of my life." Caleb blinked, his face hardening into something colder now that the mask had fallen. "Be careful what you wish for," he muttered, grabbing his keys, and stormed out. But I saw it, the flicker of fear behind his eyes. Not because of me, but because his web had snapped. His truth had leaked. And now, he had nothing left but the echo of his lies. After he left, Lily collapsed into my lap like she used to as a child, sobbing into my dress, whispering apologies until her throat turned raw. I held her. I did. Because I still loved her. But my heart didn't beat the same anymore. Trust once broken doesn't stitch back neatly. It leaves seams. It aches in the cold. That evening, my son came over. Michael looked me in the eye for the first time in weeks. "Mom," he said, voice hoarse, "I'm sorry." I didn't speak. I just nodded. Forgiveness isn't a word, it's a wound that must be reopened before it can heal. And mine had only just begun to breathe again. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, I slept in my bed without nightmares. Because the silence was no longer full of secrets. It was full of justice. Of slow, quiet, powerful justice. The morning after Caleb left, the house felt lighter, but not healed. I sat at the window sipping tea, watching birds flit between the branches of the old oak tree outside, and for the first time in weeks, the sun didn't feel like a mockery. But peace doesn't arrive like a gentle wave. It claws its way back after devastation, and the wreckage still surrounded me. My granddaughter was a shell, wandering through the house like a child lost in her own story, unsure whether to hate herself more for loving a monster or for turning on me. I didn't try to fix it. I wasn't ready. I had spent my entire life being the glue, the mat, the hands that caught the broken pieces everyone else dropped. But this time I had been the one shattered by their accusations, their silence, their willingness to believe the worst of me. The family I nurtured had turned into spectators while I burned, and only reached for the hose after the flames had devoured most of me. Later that day, my daughter-in-law Janice came by. She brought a peach cobbler, her version of an apology. She stood in my kitchen, the same one where Caleb had made his threats, and placed the dish on the counter like it could erase the words she once muttered behind my back. "We didn't know," she said. "We were blindsided." I turned to her slowly, meeting her eyes. "You didn't want to know," I replied. "You never once asked me what happened. You just joined the whispers." She looked down, cheeks flushed. "He was charming. He fooled all of us." I shook my head. "He didn't fool me. And if you had trusted me instead of your assumptions, none of this would have gone so far." Her eyes welled, but I didn't comfort her. I was tired of comforting the people who hurt me. Michael came in behind her a few minutes later, looking 10 years older, guilt stamped across his face. "Mom," he started, "there's no excuse. But I want to say it anyway. I'm sorry. I was wrong." I stared at him, the boy I once bathed in a kitchen sink, now a man who let others disgrace my name. "You didn't even hesitate," I whispered. "You let him stain me with one sentence." The silence that followed was the longest I had ever let sit between us. But I needed them to feel the weight. Not for revenge. Not out of cruelty. But because forgiveness without consequence teaches nothing. I told them I needed space. I didn't ask, I told them. For the first time in years, I didn't beg for inclusion, didn't wait to be invited to speak. I was no longer the elderly woman everyone forgot to ask how she was. I was the woman who had risen from ashes they helped ignite. I went to stay with Ruth again for a while. Her house was small, but it was honest. We drank tea and played cards, and she never once looked at me like I was fragile. "They'll come around," she said once, and I shook my head. I don't want them to come around. I want them to remember what it cost me to be believed. I was learning something now, something sharp and necessary. That family isn't about blood. It's about who holds your hand when the world calls you a liar. And for all their apologies, not a single one of them had held my hand when I was drowning. They watched me sink. And that's not something I would ever forget. It was never about revenge, not at first. All I had wanted was to be believed, to not be looked at like some pathetic old woman pining for attention. But when someone tries to rewrite your character in your final chapters, when they stain your legacy with filth they conjured for their own protection, a part of you awakens. Not a thirst for vengeance, but a hunger for truth to be loud. I spent my nights at Ruth's house scrolling quietly through the local town group on Facebook, reading cheerful posts about farmers markets and church raffles, seeing Caleb's name tagged under old fire station photos with words like hero and dedicated. My stomach turned. He had built a life on charm, on curated smiles and well-timed humility, and now he'd simply disappeared into the fog, quietly leaving Lily, skipping town before anyone could ask why. But I wasn't going to let him fade away with my dignity in his pocket. Ruth helped me. She was the one who said it. "Post it," she whispered one night as we listened to the tape again. "Let them hear him. Let them see who he really is." I was hesitant. Not because I doubted the truth, but because I knew what truth could cost. I was an old woman in a world that prized youth and narrative. But then I remembered how Lily had screamed at me. How Michael had avoided me. How Janice had called me sick. And suddenly, fear wasn't heavy anymore, it was fuel. I created a simple post on the community group. No drama. No slander. Just facts. I wrote, "This man is not who he pretended to be." For weeks, I was accused of behavior I did not commit. This is what he said to me, thinking no one would ever hear it. I uploaded the recording. Pressed post. And sat back. Ruth squeezed my hand, and we didn't speak. We just waited. The first comment came within minutes. Then 10. Then 40. Shock. Disbelief. Then fury. People who knew him. People who had worked with him. Mothers whose kids had taken photos with him at the firehouse. Women who admitted they'd always felt something off about him. One woman commented, "He cornered me at a charity event once. I thought I was crazy for feeling uncomfortable." Another wrote, "We owe you an apology, Eleanor. Thank you for your bravery." The town was ablaze by sundown. Caleb's charm had turned to poison in the public eye. And this time I was the one holding the matches. The local news picked up the story a week later. Not the national networks, but our local cable channel, Channel 5. They requested an interview. I declined. I didn't want a stage. I had no desire to become a headline. All I wanted was peace, and the truth to walk through this town louder than the lies had. But the effect rippled regardless. Caleb's face vanished from every public mural, every volunteer photo. His job had already been lost after the tape, quietly and without a statement. But now, people knew why. He was not just let go. He was unmasked. And Lily, poor Lily, walked into town now with eyes following her. Some pitying. Some questioning. Some cruel. But all aware. And me? I returned home that weekend. Not to forgive, not to resume the same routine, but because that house, my house, was mine again. I walked through it with different steps now. Not the quiet shuffle of a woman trying not to be a burden, but the calm, steady footsteps of someone who had survived a storm no one believed was real. I took down every photo of Caleb. I burned his wedding portrait in the fireplace. And I kept the recorder on my nightstand, not because I feared another attack, but because it was the symbol of the moment I stopped letting their version of me win. They wrote me off. But I rewrote myself. And now the town knew it too. The fire crackled softly as I sat alone in the living room, the wedding photo of Lily and Caleb now reduced to curled edges and black ash in the hearth. I watched it burn slowly, deliberately, as if the lies embedded in its glossy surface didn't want to let go of the frame. But I needed to watch it disappear, needed to see the face of the man who nearly ruined me with a single lie crumble into nothing. The air still smelled faintly of his cologne. It clung to the cushions on the sofa, the jacket he left behind, the spare blanket that once covered both him and my granddaughter while they watched TV. I gathered those things in a plastic bin and left them outside by the garbage. I didn't flinch when I heard the lid slam shut. I had no space left in my home for remnants of someone who tried to hollow me out from the inside. But the hardest part wasn't erasing him, it was what he left behind inside the people I loved. Lily barely spoke. She drifted through rooms like a ghost, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow, the weight of betrayal clinging to her like wet wool. She had loved him with all the foolish hope of youth, with the kind of blind trust you only give to someone when you've never been betrayed before. I'd watched her fall for him, watched her marry him under strings of backyard lights and laughter. I'd helped her stitch the hem of her dress the night before her wedding. And now, every stitch felt like a betrayal of its own. One afternoon, I found her in my sewing room, sitting quietly, holding that same dress in her lap. "I don't know who I am without him," she whispered, voice as fragile as the lace in her hands. I walked in and placed my palm on her shoulder. "You are who you've always been," I said gently. "He just made you forget." She looked up at me then, and for the first time, I saw the real Lily beneath the layers of shame and regret. She wasn't just heartbroken, she was humiliated. She had turned on the woman who raised her to protect a man who stripped her identity piece by piece. And now she was sitting in the rubble, unsure whether to cry or build something new. I didn't press her. Grief doesn't move on a schedule. Neither does guilt. Michael came by again the next day. He brought groceries, not to be helpful but because he still didn't know how to look me in the eye. He hovered in the kitchen, placing cans in cabinets like that would make up for his silence when I needed his voice the most. "I should have believed you," he finally said. But I was scared. Scared of being wrong. Of admitting I didn't see what was right in front of me. I looked at him for a long moment. "You weren't scared of being wrong," I said quietly. "You were scared I might be right." He winced, and for the first time I didn't soften. I didn't offer the warmth I used to wrap around my family like a blanket. I let the cold stay in the room with us. He needed to feel it. The phone rang that evening, my landline, the one no one ever used anymore. I let it go to voicemail. But curiosity pulled me back. It was Caleb's voice. Calm. Too calm. "Eleanor," he said, "you may think you've won. But people forget. Stories fade. Soon you'll just be another bitter old woman with a tape and a tail. And I'll be back on my feet. So enjoy your moment." I didn't delete it. I saved it. Stored it. Not because I feared him, but because his arrogance was a rope he was still tightening around his own neck. And someday, I might need that voicemail. Not for the law. But for Lily. To remind her that monsters don't always growl, they sometimes whisper. As I went to bed that night, I didn't pray for peace. I didn't ask for things to go back to how they were. Because the woman who existed before Caleb's lies was gone. She had been replaced by someone quieter, sharper, heavier with truth. I lay on my pillow, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly overhead, and I made myself one promise: I would never again let someone else write the ending to my story. I had already burned the chapter they tried to force on me. And now, with ash on my hands and fire in my chest, I was ready to write my own. I hadn't looked in the mirror properly in weeks. Not really. Not since the day Lily threw those accusations at me with a voice I didn't recognize and a gaze that cut deeper than any blade. But that morning, as the kettle hissed and the silence hummed through the kitchen like a warning and a comfort all at once, I walked into the bathroom and forced myself to stare. At first, all I saw were the usual things: soft skin folded with age, eyes that had dimmed just slightly since the spring, lips pressed into the thin line of someone who had spent her life swallowing her words. But then I saw the other details, the ones Caleb didn't see, the ones my family forgot. The steel in my jaw. The steadiness in my gaze. The way grief and betrayal hadn't curled me into a ball, but honed me into something sharp, something unignorable. I was not a fragile old woman. I was a survivor. Of a marriage that wasn't kind. Of motherhood that hadn't always been fair. Of a world that discarded women once their usefulness faded. I had survived that. And now I had survived this. The town's whispers hadn't stopped since the recording went public. People looked at me differently now, not with pity, not with suspicion, but with something else. Respect. Maybe even fear. I ran into a woman at the pharmacy, Susan Price, the same woman who once told Lily I was a bit much to handle at that age. She touched my arm and said, "I'm sorry. I judged you. I was wrong." I nodded, said nothing. She didn't deserve my words. She deserved the silence I was accused with. I walked home carrying my groceries alone, but with a spine straighter than it had been in years. I passed Caleb's old firehouse. His name had been scraped from the plaque out front. They'd painted over it with fresh blue, but if you looked close, you could still see the ghost of the letters beneath. That felt fitting. Let his legacy haunt the very place he pretended to serve. Lily had started therapy. She told me over tea one evening, her voice hesitant. "I need help, Grandma," she admitted, stirring her mug even though nothing was in it. "I need to understand why I couldn't see him for who he was. Why I let him turn me against you." I didn't rush to comfort her. I simply reached out and held her wrist, not tightly, but firmly. "Healing starts with admitting what you broke," I said. "And what you ignored while it shattered." She nodded, eyes glossy but grateful. The distance between us was still there. But now, it wasn't a wall, it was a bridge slowly being built with bricks of accountability. Still, I was careful. Trust, once betrayed, is not a blanket you offer again out of habit. It's a lockbox. And she was still looking for the key. That night, I sat at my writing desk and opened an old leather journal I hadn't touched since George passed. I began to write, not for them, not for the public, but for me. I wrote what it felt like to be touched without consent by someone who thought your age made you invisible. I wrote about the shame that crept in when your own blood turned its back. I wrote about the silence. The suffocating, soul-splitting silence. And I wrote about the rage. The cleansing, quiet, necessary rage that pushed me to record, to reveal, to rise. I wrote for the woman in the mirror. The one with crow's feet around her eyes and a lion's heart beneath her ribcage. The one who wasn't just a victim. Who was never just a grandmother. Never just an old woman in a corner chair. That night, I wrote her back into her rightful place, not at the edges of the story, but at the center of it. Where she had always belonged. It was the little things that returned first. The way Lily began to say grandma again, gently, almost reverently, as though the title now carried the weight it once lost. The way Michael stood during our Sunday meals to pull out my chair, his hands awkward, unsure if he was making peace or begging for it. The way Janice offered me the first slice of cake at Ruth's retirement party, her eyes apologizing faster than her lips ever could. No one said much outright, but the change was felt like wind in an old house, slow, soft, undeniable. For weeks, they had reduced me to whispers, turned me into an inconvenience they didn't know what to do with. But now, without Caleb to blind them, they began to see me again, not as an old relic in a floral robe, but as a woman with memory, with truth, with sharpness wrapped in silence. They didn't dare question me now. That era had passed. I wasn't someone you dismissed anymore. I was Eleanor Walsh. And my name was no longer a subject of shame, but the beginning of their redemption. The women from church called too, first Ruth, then Greta, then a handful of others. They all wanted to say they were sorry. Not just for what happened, but for not noticing. For not asking. "You always looked so strong," one of them said. "We didn't think you could be a victim." I didn't say what I wanted to. That strength doesn't mean we can't be hurt, that sometimes the strongest people carry their trauma with their tea tray. Instead, I just said, "Next time, ask." And left it there. Because they weren't the enemy. Not like Caleb. Not like the part of my family that had chosen the easy lie over the hard truth. But they had stood still while I drowned, and that stillness still stung. I caught a glimpse of myself in a shop window later that week, carrying a tote of fresh peaches from the farmer's market. My reflection startled me, not because I looked different, but because I looked sure. I hadn't felt sure in months. I hadn't trusted my own instincts, my own body, my own voice. But now, I walked differently. I moved like a woman who knew no one could silence her again. The whispers were still there. Some people don't know how to let go of scandal, but they didn't pierce me anymore. Let them talk. Let them remember. Their noise was no match for the evidence I carried. One evening, Lily brought me an envelope. Inside were divorce papers. Signed. Official. "It's done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't just kick him out. I erased him." I looked at her long and slow, then said, "You didn't erase him. You ended the lie." She cried, not for him, I think, but for the years she gave to a man who used her heart as a shield. I held her hand, just for a moment. Not as forgiveness, but as something close. That night, I added one more page to my journal. I wrote about what it felt like to reclaim your name. To walk into a room and not have to explain yourself anymore. To be believed without evidence, because now, they knew what I was capable of if they ever doubted me again. I no longer needed their validation. But I kept the recorder anyway. Not out of fear, but as a reminder that the truth is often quiet. But when spoken at the right time, it echoes forever. Some reckonings don't come with fireworks or apologies drenched in dramatic tears, they arrive in the small gestures, in the silence that no longer accuses but quietly tries to make amends. And that's exactly what began to happen as spring turned into summer. I'd catch Michael glancing at me during dinner, not out of discomfort this time, but regret he didn't yet know how to name. Janice baked more often, always too much so she had an excuse to bring me the extra, as if flaky crusts and cinnamon sugar could patch the rip in our bond. I let her. Not because I forgave her fully, but because I understood that shame has its own language, and some people only know how to speak through deeds. Lily, on the other hand, had stopped trying to pretend. She came to me often now, not to apologize again, but to sit quietly on the porch beside me. No phone. No talking. Just her presence. That, I appreciated most of all. She wasn't trying to make it disappear, she was learning to live with it, like I had. One morning, she brought me a small photo album. "I found these," she said, handing it to me with careful hands. Inside were pictures of us, me holding her as a baby, braiding her hair before school, the two of us laughing in the garden. There were none of Caleb. She had removed him completely. As I turned the pages, I saw my own face evolve through the decades, younger, smiling, worn but proud, and then, a few recent ones where my eyes looked hollow even behind the smile. I paused at one of those. "This was taken the week it all started," I murmured. "I remember how hard I was trying to look okay." Lily's eyes filled. "I see it now," she whispered. "I should have seen it then." But she hadn't. None of them had. And the truth was, they didn't want to. It's easier to believe the story that comforts you than the one that convicts you. They chose the easier truth, and I paid the price. But now, they wore that price like a second skin. Michael invited me to Sunday service and introduced me to the pastor as my brave mother. Janice insisted I sit at the head of the table during family dinners, subtly shifting the dynamic she once helped diminish. Even the neighbors had changed their tone, no longer giving me that cautious, sidelong glance when I walked by. Some waved. Some said, "Good morning, Mrs. Walsh," with a sincerity that hadn't been there before. I had become something of a myth in town, not because I was dramatic, but because I had survived something quietly and spoken up anyway. That made people uncomfortable. And admiration often begins where discomfort fails. But through it all, I still held my distance. Because a woman who's been falsely accused by those she loves never fully returns to who she was before. You can rebuild the house, yes, but you remember where the flames started. You remember who handed the match. And you never again sleep with the door unlocked. I took to gardening again, pulling weeds with the same hands that had once cradled my granddaughter and now carried the strength of someone who had buried betrayal and planted boundaries. I started teaching at the community center, writing workshops for older women. I told them, your story matters, even when they pretend it doesn't. Some cried. Some wrote poems. Some just held my hand and nodded. We knew each other without speaking. We were the generation taught to endure in silence. But not anymore. That night, as I locked the house and turned off the porch light, I paused at the hall mirror again. Not to study my face, but to speak aloud for the first time in weeks. I forgive you, I said, not to Caleb, not to my family, but to myself, for the nights I stayed silent, for the times I doubted my own gut, for allowing shame to sit on my chest like a guest who overstayed her welcome. I whispered it once more, gently, to the woman who once feared no one would believe her. I forgive you. And for the first time in months, I meant it. It was a Tuesday afternoon, hot and slow, when the knock came. I was in the kitchen steeping mint tea, humming to myself, feeling the kind of peace that doesn't come from forgetting, but from surviving. The knock was hesitant. Not hurried or rude, but timid. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the front door expecting a neighbor, maybe a delivery man. Instead, I saw her, mid-30s, pretty in a plain sort of way, with tired eyes and trembling fingers wrapped tightly around her purse strap. Are you Mrs. Eleanor Walsh? She asked, voice barely audible. I nodded. She looked down, swallowed hard, and then said a name I thought I'd never hear again without venom. I used to know Caleb. My heart froze. Every part of me tensed, ready for a confrontation, ready for a lie, maybe even an attack. But she wasn't here to defend him. That much I saw immediately in her face. She was here to confess. Her name was Miranda. She'd dated Caleb years before he met Lily. They were engaged briefly, back when he was still in Fire Academy. He always had this charm, she said, sitting at my kitchen table, hands shaking as she cupped the mug I gave her. People thought he was so good. But behind closed doors, her voice cracked. She took a deep breath. He manipulated me. Made me think I was crazy if I questioned him. Controlled everything. Where I went. Who I saw. He never hit me, but his words, she trailed off, eyes glassy. I knew that look. The look of a woman who's been bruised by words sharper than fists. I left him after I caught him messaging my cousin, she said. But it took years to believe I wasn't the one who ruined it. I sat in silence, letting her spill the things she'd held inside for too long. And when she pulled a folder from her bag, filled with screenshots, typed accounts, even a letter she'd once tried to send to Caleb's job but never found the courage, I understood. She wasn't just here to tell me her story. She was here to confirm mine. I saw your story online, Miranda said. I saw what you did. And I thought, maybe if I come forward, people will finally stop thinking he's just charming. Maybe they'll understand that it wasn't your fault. My eyes welled, not from pain this time, but from the strange, aching grace of solidarity. For months, I had fought alone, buried under judgment. Now here was a stranger, young, bruised in her own way, bringing me her truth like an offering. I took the folder, held it gently, and whispered, thank you. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It never was. Caleb had been a predator long before he stepped into our home. I was just the one who finally pulled off his mask. Miranda stayed for hours. We didn't talk about everything, some things were still too raw for both of us. But before she left, she looked me in the eye and said something I didn't expect to hear from anyone, you gave me courage. I thought no one would believe me. But when they tried to humiliate you, you didn't disappear. You proved them wrong. After she left, I sat on the couch holding the folder, breathing slowly. The weight of what she gave me wasn't just evidence. It was validation. My fight hadn't just protected me, it had started a ripple. And I realized then that sometimes the deepest victories come not when your enemies fall, but when your truth helps someone else rise. Later that night, I called Lily. I told her about Miranda. We sat in stunned silence, the truth settling like dust across old furniture. I thought I knew him, Lily whispered. I thought I was his exception. I didn't say anything right away. Then I told her softly, men like that don't have exceptions. They have targets. And for once, she didn't cry. She just breathed. Steady, slow, aware. We were both healing, but not backward. We were rebuilding forward. With open eyes. And brick by brick, I was no longer the woman blamed for someone else's sin, I was the woman who exposed it, so no one else had to carry that shame alone. There was a time, not long ago, when I would walk through the church doors with my head bowed, not out of reverence, but shame. People didn't speak outright, but I felt it, the cold glances, the pause in conversation when I passed, the whispered tones just beneath the hymns. They all believed I had seduced my granddaughter's husband. That I had stepped out of my place, overstepped my age, and brought humiliation upon the family. That guilt used to wrap itself around my ankles like chains every Sunday. But this time, as I stepped onto the sunlit steps of the church, I wore no weight. I wore a navy coat, silver pin, and a face that dared anyone to doubt me now. The recording had spoken. Miranda's visit had confirmed it. And I had nothing left to fear. I walked down the aisle, not rushing, not hesitating, just steady. Ruth saved me a seat near the front, like always, and as I passed familiar faces, I didn't look away. This time, they looked away first. Not because I was shameful, but because they were ashamed. Of what they'd assumed. Of what they said. Of what they didn't say when I was being crucified in whispers. The sermon that morning was about the truth setting you free. I almost laughed. Because freedom hadn't come in the shape of revelation, it came through resistance. Through staying silent long enough to gather my voice, and then using it like thunder. After service, people lined up to speak with me. Some offered weak smiles. Others finally spoke the words they owed me. You were right. I'm sorry. I believed him, and I was wrong. I accepted their words, but not their excuses. They had chosen comfort over character, and though I forgave, I would never forget who looked away when I needed them most. Back home, I set Miranda's folder in a drawer beside my journal. The evidence was safe, but I no longer needed to keep it close. My power no longer lived in proof, it lived in presence. And that presence began to matter in ways I hadn't expected. A young woman from the community center, barely 20, approached me during my writing class. You remind me of my grandma, she said, eyes wide with admiration. But stronger. Like you made it out of something big. I nodded, heart tight. I did, I said. And so will you. Because now I understood that telling my story wasn't just about clearing my name, it was about lighting a path for others who would otherwise walk through darkness, thinking no one had ever made it out. That evening, Lily made dinner. She insisted. Baked cod and roasted potatoes, the way I used to make it for her when she was little. She wore her apron crooked and her hair tied back like the girl I used to brush after bath time. We sat together, just the two of us. No phones. No distractions. Just her, rebuilding a bridge she had once set fire to. After dinner, she handed me a folded piece of paper. It's from Caleb, she said softly. My body tensed. I opened it slowly. It wasn't an apology, it was a threat laced in arrogance, claiming I'd ruined him, calling me bitter, delusional, saying no one stays on your side forever. I folded it again without a word and dropped it into the flames of the fireplace. Watched it curl, blacken, and vanish. We won't give him space in this house, I said. And she nodded, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. In that moment, something shifted. Not in the house, but in me. I had spent months wondering if I'd ever be able to walk through a room without the stench of blame on my skin. But now, I wasn't hiding from the fire anymore. I was the fire. And everything that had once tried to consume me was nothing but smoke behind me. It was dusk when I saw him again, Caleb. After all the silence, the scorched pride, the voicemail threats, the town's scorn, he had the audacity to come back. I was sitting on the porch, a soft shawl draped over my shoulders, a book open in my lap I hadn't really been reading. The sky was bruised purple, the air quiet except for cicadas, and then I saw him step out of a black sedan parked across the street. He didn't walk with the same confidence anymore. The swagger was gone. The hair not as neat, the button-down wrinkled, the false shine in his eyes dimmed. But danger has many disguises, and I felt my body stiffen like instinct alone was holding me upright. He didn't walk to the door, he stood at the gate, fingers curled around the iron bars like a man trying to press himself into a home he no longer belonged to. "Eleanor," he called out. Calm. Measured. Like nothing had ever happened. "I just want to talk." I closed my book, stood up, and stepped off the porch. My back didn't bend. My voice didn't shake. "You don't speak to me," I said. "Not now. Not ever." He laughed, hollow and bitter. "I lost everything. My job. My name. My life. Because of one little tape." I walked closer, but not too close. "You lost everything," I said slowly, "because of your own words. Your own lies. Your own hands." He looked down, jaw tight. Then he muttered, "You're not as innocent as they think you are." I tilted my head. "And you're not as clever as you think you are." I could see him trying to decide if it was worth exploding or walking away. Men like Caleb hate losing the script. But I wasn't playing a role anymore. I was the author now. "I didn't come here to fight," he said after a beat. "I came to ask you to stop. Take the posts down. Talk to Lily. Tell her to reconsider." That's when I laughed. Not loud. Not cruel. Just a breath of disbelief that he still thought I could be swayed. "You burned your own bridge," I said. "Now you're choking on the smoke." Lily must have seen him from the window. She came out barefoot, eyes ablaze. "What the hell are you doing here?" she snapped, stepping between us. Her voice was steel. Her arms shook. "You don't get to show up. Not after what you did. Not after what you almost cost me." Caleb's mask slipped then. "You were nothing before me," he growled. "I made you feel important." Lily's eyes narrowed, and she took a slow step forward. "No," she said, voice low and fierce, "you made me feel invisible. It was Grandma who reminded me who I am." He stared at her like she had betrayed him. Like the version of her that used to bend over backward for him had died, and maybe she had. He looked at me one last time, his lip curled in disgust. "Enjoy the sympathy. It doesn't last forever." And then he left. But that night, for the first time in months, I didn't check the locks twice. I didn't stare at my phone, waiting for threats. I didn't sleep with the recorder under my pillow. I just sat at the kitchen table with Lily. We had warm soup. We played cards. We laughed a little. And when I walked past the mirror before bed, I saw not a woman haunted by fear, but one cloaked in peace. Caleb's return didn't rattle me. If anything, it proved just how far I had come. Because when evil no longer terrifies you, when it shrinks before your gaze instead of growing, then you've won something bigger than justice. You've won yourself back. It began with a folded flyer slipped beneath my front door, subtle, unassuming, printed on soft pink paper with delicate black text. The community center was hosting a women's forum called Voices That Weren't Heard, a day-long event for survivors of coercion, manipulation, and emotional abuse. The note attached read, "We heard what you did. Would you consider sharing your story?" I sat with the flyer for a long time, fingers tracing its edges, heart unsure. I wasn't a speaker. I was a quiet woman, a background presence, someone who lived behind casseroles and garden clippers and polite smiles. But lately, I had become something more. Not because I wanted to, but because the silence nearly destroyed me. I folded the flyer and tucked it into my apron pocket. I wasn't sure if I'd say yes. But I didn't throw it away either. A week later, I found myself standing on a small stage in a community room lit with string lights and filled with folding chairs and paper coffee cups. Most of the women in the audience looked like me, gray-haired, wide-eyed, a little hesitant. Some clutched tissues. Some sat with their daughters. And a few were girls young enough to be Lily. I gripped the microphone with both hands, my palms damp, my voice locked behind years of second-guessing. But then I looked at them, the women, and I remembered what it felt like to be blamed. To be called a liar. To be told I was imagining it. And suddenly, the words weren't hard to find. I was accused of something I didn't do, I began. Not by strangers, but by my own family. Their faces held still. No gasps. No frowns. Just quiet recognition. A man, my granddaughter's husband, made advances toward me. Subtle at first. Then threatening. I told no one. Because I knew what they would think. I knew how quickly a woman like me, older, widowed, with wrinkles on her hands and a soft voice, could be painted as desperate. I paused, swallowed, then continued. He twisted the story before I ever opened my mouth. And the people I loved believed him. A few heads nodded. A woman near the back covered her mouth. I was humiliated. Shamed. Shoved into a corner of my own home. But I fought back. Not with fists. Not even with my voice at first. But with a recorder. With the truth. And when that truth came out, everything changed. After the talk, they lined up to speak with me, one by one. Some hugged me. Some cried. One woman said, "My brother-in-law did the same." I was too scared to say it. Another whispered, "You said what I've been holding for 30 years. I realized then that I hadn't just told my story. I had told ours. And in that moment, I didn't feel old. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt powerful. That night, Lily greeted me with dinner already set. She'd been watching a live stream of the talk. "Grandma," she said softly, "I'm so proud of you." Her eyes were wet. "You didn't just save me. You saved others too." I pulled her into a hug, firm and full. She had changed. She wasn't the same girl who once screamed accusations. She was growing, learning. And maybe, so was I. Later, I sat at my writing desk and added a new page to my journal. I used to be afraid that no one would believe me. Now I'm afraid of staying silent when I see another woman living what I lived. I've earned my voice back. And I will use it. I wasn't searching for anything. I'd gone into the attic that afternoon simply to sort through old boxes, ones filled with forgotten ornaments, dusty photo albums, and scraps of a life that used to feel simpler. But grief has a way of tucking itself into corners, and healing sometimes arrives in the form of unexpected paper. I found it in a shoebox, buried beneath yellowed doilies and brittle newspaper clippings. A letter, folded 3 times, sealed in a plain white envelope. The handwriting was unmistakably Lily's. Not the Lily I knew now, who had grown wiser and softer, but the one from a few months ago, hurting, confused, and drowning in shame she hadn't known how to name. I hesitated before opening it. My fingers trembled as I peeled the flap and unfolded the pages. The ink was slightly smudged, like it had been written through tears. "Dear Grandma," it began, "I don't know if I'll ever be able to say this out loud. But I need you to know what I saw. What I did. And how sorry I am." She went on to recount the day she saw the fake messages Caleb had shown her, how he had rehearsed the story with such precision, how he even cried, real tears, the kind that make women believe. "He made me believe I was protecting you," she wrote. "He said you were lonely, confused. And I thought, maybe it was possible. Maybe grief had changed you. I wanted so badly for it not to be true, but instead of asking you, I buried you with doubt." The words cut deep, not because they hurt, but because they confirmed what I had long suspected: she hadn't just failed to believe me. She had chosen to believe him because it was easier. Because it fit the narrative. But the letter didn't stop there. She detailed how, after the truth came out, she began to question every part of their marriage. How controlling he'd been with her wardrobe. How he demanded passwords, questioned friendships, guilt her into silence. I thought I was in love, she wrote, but I was in a cage. And I watched him turn you into his excuse when I finally started rattling the bars. That line made me put the letter down. I sat there, in the attic's dusty stillness, letting it all settle. The betrayal. The survival. The acknowledgement. This was the closure I didn't know I needed. Not a grand gesture. Not public praise. But her honesty. Her full, unfiltered confession. I finished reading the letter and placed it back in the envelope, folding it carefully like something sacred. It didn't erase what happened. But it gave me something stronger than forgiveness, it gave me understanding. That evening, I didn't confront Lily with it. I didn't ask why she never gave it to me. Some truths are written only for the writer's healing. Instead, I made us tea and lit a candle. We sat together quietly on the porch, the air soft with early autumn. She leaned her head on my shoulder. And for the first time, I felt no ache in the silence. Only peace. Before going to bed, I tucked the letter into my journal. I wrote beneath it, "She saw the storm too late, but she's helping rebuild the house." Then I turned off the light and climbed into bed without dread. Because now, there were no more secrets. Only scars. And scars, unlike wounds, are proof of healing. Proof that we survived what tried to silence us. There's a moment, after the fire is gone, after the smoke clears, after the silence softens, when life begins to hum again. Not loudly. Not all at once. But gently. Like a whisper that says, "You're still here." For me, that moment came on a breezy Wednesday morning when I found myself standing in the backyard, staring at the rusted hook where my wind chimes used to hang. They had been taken down months ago, maybe by Lily, maybe by me, I can't remember. But I remembered the reason. Caleb had said they were too loud. Said they kept him up at night. Said they made the house feel cluttered. So I took them down. Like I took myself down. Quietly. One piece at a time. Until my presence in this house was nothing but folded laundry, quiet footsteps, and swallowed words. But now, the sky was clear. The wind was moving. And I was still standing. So I went into the shed, found the chimes where they were tucked behind the holiday boxes, and carried them back with both hands like a small ceremony. They were a little dusty. The strings a little tangled. But when I hung them back on the hook and the breeze caught them, they sang. High and soft and lovely. Like a memory returning. Lily heard it from inside and stepped out onto the porch. She watched me but didn't speak. She didn't need to. We both understood what it meant. I wasn't just decorating. I was reclaiming sound. Space. Self. That same day, I rearranged the living room. Moved the armchair to face the window, where I could see the garden. Hung new curtains. Threw away the throw pillows Caleb once called old lady frilly. I am an old lady. But I am also Eleanor. And Eleanor survived something no one thought she would. That deserves frilly if she wants it. That weekend, I hosted Sunday lunch, not at Lily's, not at Michael's, but in my house. My table. My rules. I cooked too much, as always, roast chicken, honey carrots, the good rolls from the bakery on Main. Ruth came too, bless her heart, bringing her famous lemon tart. We sat around the table like nothing had ever cracked between us, but we knew better. We knew the silence was now respect, not avoidance. Michael offered to carve the chicken. Janice helped clear plates. And Lily. Lily stood behind me when I rose to make a toast. To second chances, I said, raising my glass. Not for the ones who betrayed us, but for the ones who chose to return and do the work of healing. They all raised their glasses. No one cried. No one needed to. The grief had already passed. What remained was something far stronger. Something woven with honesty and time. Later that evening, when the house was quiet again, I sat by the window, listening to the chimes. The wind wasn't loud, but it was steady. It didn't ask permission. It didn't apologize for its presence. It simply moved through the trees like it belonged. And that, I realized, was the life I was building for myself now. One that didn't need to be explained, defended, or diminished. One where I could speak, and people would listen. One where I could rest, and no one would accuse me of being weak. One where I could exist fully, freely, and without shame. I had hung the wind chimes again. And they were singing, not for forgiveness. Not for sympathy. But for me. It was a letter from a stranger that reminded me how far this story had reached. It arrived one crisp autumn morning, tucked in a lavender envelope with no return address. The handwriting was delicate, unfamiliar. I opened it slowly, expecting perhaps a thank you from a former student at the community center. But it wasn't that. It was a 4-page letter from a woman named Margaret, who lived 3 towns over. She had read about me, not just in the online post, but in a blog someone had written about the women's forum I spoke at. She called me brave, yes, but not in the loud, hollow way people sometimes do. She called me necessary. You gave me permission to say the thing I've never said, she wrote. When my brother-in-law touched me at 17, I told no one. I became the silent woman in the family photo. I cooked and smiled and stayed quiet. Until I read about you. I cried quietly reading her words. Not from pain, but from the realization that telling the truth does more than clear your name. It makes a clearing in the woods for others to speak to. That same day, Lily found me on the porch with the letter in my lap. She sat beside me, uninvited but welcome, and rested her head on my shoulder. I'm proud of you, she said softly. You didn't just get justice. You gave us all something better. I turned to look at her. You believed me too late, I reminded her. I know, she said. But I'll never forget it again. I didn't say anything after that. We just watched the wind move through the trees, shaking loose the first golden leaves of the season. Later that evening, I pulled the old recorder from the drawer. Not to replay the past, but to finally release it. I held it in my hands for a long time before sliding the cassette out and placing it gently in a box with the letter from Lily, Miranda's folder, and the town's original flyer from the forum. I labeled it, My Story, when they tried to silence me. I didn't do it to preserve bitterness. I did it so I'd never forget the sound of my own voice coming back to life. I tucked the box into my chest of drawers, beneath old scarves and folded linens. I'd keep it not as evidence, but as armor, for the woman I used to be, and the girl Lily once was. Because even though the worst had passed, truth was not something I would ever again treat lightly. It was the difference between who I had been and who I was now. Before bed, I walked outside one last time. The wind chimes whispered in the dark, soft and metallic and honest. A car passed on the distant road. The house was still. I looked up at the stars and smiled, not because I had won, but because I had survived, and shaped something good out of something cruel. This wasn't just about Caleb anymore. It was about every woman who had ever been doubted, dismissed, or degraded. It was about legacy. And this was mine. Before we begin, let me say something from my heart. If this story has touched you, if you've ever been doubted, dismissed, or silenced, please like, share, and subscribe my channel. And tell me in the comments, where are you from, and who do you believe finally deserves to be heard? I want to know. I want to listen. Because someone once refused to hear me, and it nearly broke me. But not anymore. The truth is, I never wanted to be the center of any story. I was content being the grandmother who baked too much, the widow who smiled politely at gatherings, the old woman who loved her family enough to shrink herself when they needed more room. I never wanted to hold up a mirror to anyone's cruelty or teach lessons through pain. But when Caleb looked at me with desire twisted into control, and when my own blood turned against me, I became something I never expected. I became the witness. The one who refused to forget. The one who dared to remember everything. And that memory? It saved me. Months have passed since then. The leaves have fallen twice. The gossip has quieted. The wounds have scarred. Caleb never returned again, not physically. But his name still echoes in whispers, in cautionary tales, in women who finally say, "I believe you," instead of, "Are you sure?" Lily is thriving now. She started her own support group for young women, women who've survived coercive relationships, women who no longer mistake silence for peace. She invites me to speak sometimes. We sit side by side in folding chairs, and I watch her now with a pride I can barely contain. She became a better version of herself through the fire. Just like I did. Michael and Janice have changed too. They don't tiptoe around me anymore. They respect me now in the way they should have long ago. And though the old pain sometimes flickers like a scar in cold weather, I no longer live in that moment of betrayal. I live in the aftermath. And in the aftermath, I built a life. A few weeks ago, the town hosted a women's honor luncheon. They surprised me with a nomination. When my name was called, I walked up slowly, the whole room standing. Not for the gossip. Not for the scandal. But for the truth I dared to tell. They handed me a small plaque. It said, "To Eleanor Walsh, for bravery, integrity, and the reminder that no one is ever too old to be believed." And that night, when I returned home, I placed the plaque not on a shelf, but right by the front door. So every time someone enters this house, they know who lives here now. An old woman? Yes. But not just that. A warrior. A witness. A woman whose name was dragged through mud, then painted in gold. And I hope, if you're listening to this, if you've ever been silenced or blamed for someone else's sins, you'll remember my voice. And more importantly, you'll remember yours. Because the worst part wasn't what he did. It was how easily they believed him. And the best part? They don't anymore.